The European Union has lifted all political and economic sanctions against Myanmar in recognition of what it calls the country's remarkable process of democratic reform. But it stopped short of removing an arms embargo and warned that the Southeast Asian nation must curb recent outbursts of ethnic violence. Human Rights Watch says lifting the sanctions is premature and has accused the government of waging a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya community. Phil Robertson is Deputy Asia Director of Human Rights Watch. Phil Robertson, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me on the program.
Your latest report accuses Myanmar authorities of a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Rohingya Muslims. The report makes for some disturbing reading, yet the EU has just decided to permanently lift all economic sanctions against the government. That seems to be an unusual decision in light of your report.
It's certainly an unusual decision, and in fact it's a premature decision that doesn't reflect an assessment of the facts on the ground in Arakan State and other parts of Burma. Our view is that unfortunately the EU is allowing economic interests and investment interests to trump human rights in their policy towards Burma. We think that they need to maintain the strategic strength of having the option of implementing sanctions, simply to keep the government on the straight and narrow and keep them following up on the promises they've made to the international community to ensure reform of human rights and movement towards a broader, more participatory democracy.
There's been some very graphic footage that has come out recently, reportedly showing the violence going on in Rakhine State, which is also known as Arakan State. Are you saying that Myanmar's government and its security forces actually took part in these attacks on Muslims, or did they just sanction it?
In a number of cases, there was direct participation by police, by riot police, by the Nasaka border guard, and by the army in instances of attacking Rohingyas, often when they were trying to put out the fires that the mobs had set in their mosques and their communities. So yes, there was direct participation in some cases. In other cases, the security forces knew that these attacks were coming and simply did nothing to stop them. In one particularly disturbing case in the village of Yante, the security forces disarmed the Rohingya who were surrounded by a Buddhist Arakanese mob, and a massacre proceeded.
Yet the Myanmar government denies any involvement in the violence.
Well, unfortunately, their denial came out so fast, one wonders whether they even read the report. The claim that this was one-sided doesn't address substantively any of the major issues that we've found.
Going back to the lifting of sanctions, is Human Rights Watch suggesting that by rushing to lift economic sanctions, the EU, the US, Australia and others are in effect turning a blind eye to what's been going on in Rakhine State?
I think that the way to put it, I would say, is they're being strategically deficient in understanding what they need to do to continue to pressure the government of Burma to make progress on human rights. Much of the progress to date, I think, has come because of external pressure, because of the international community's push on human rights. And for them to abandon this strategy midstream, especially when the downside, such as maintaining the sanctions but suspending them, would be so easy to do.
But you do acknowledge that Myanmar has come a long way in terms of political and other reforms. Shouldn't that be rewarded?
Well, we would certainly agree that there has been progress in terms of media reform, trade union rights, and other areas. But, you know, if we look at what the EU ministers have done, last year in April 2012, they set out a set of benchmarks on human rights to assess progress. This year, they essentially walked away from those benchmarks such as release of political prisoners, ending of ethnic violence, improving the situation for the Rohingya, dealing with repressive laws that are still in the books. All those problems have still not been solved, yet the European Union has decided for its own reasons to change the criteria and essentially move forward based on an assumption rather than an objective assessment of facts.
What would you have Western governments do? Reinstate these economic and trade sanctions? We know that sanctions have had a disastrous impact on the people of Myanmar.
I think the more important issue right now is for the international community to work together to pressure the government of Burma to focus on accountability for serious human rights violations. What we see right now also in Arakan State is an impending humanitarian disaster. Because of the policies of the government focusing on blocking aid or making aid difficult to reach to the Rohingya, we have 125,000 internally displaced persons in a string of squalid camps, essentially in flood zones, who have inadequate food, lack of access to medical services, and are facing a monsoon season that's going to start in a little less than a week. So, when we talk about the issue of economic sanctions, this is all about maintaining political leverage and trying to be able to pressure the government of Burma to not give an inappropriate signal that everything is okay, that there's an all clear, and that everything is going forward in a happy-go-lucky way that doesn't recognize that there are very serious problems on the ground on human rights in Burma.
Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono is visiting Myanmar this week. Does Jakarta and Myanmar's other neighbours also have an important role to play here?
They certainly do. And unfortunately, to date, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and other frontline states like Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia have done remarkably little to publicly pressure the Burmese government to accept the Rohingya as citizens of their country and to understand that there has to be a solution to prevent a regional boat people crisis that is now starting to come up because of the desperation of the Rohingya people on the ground in Arakan State.
Have you been surprised that opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi hasn't spoken out more about the situation? She's been quite heavily criticised for staying silent. Do you believe she should be doing more?
Well, it's interesting that someone who is an opposition party leader has been so quiet on an issue where it's quite clear that someone needs to call the government out and demand action. Nowhere in the world have I seen an opposition leader say so little about what certainly has to be a major scandal and a human rights travesty perpetrated by a government. I think many people have hoped for much more from her. She has a moral authority that is above and beyond your average opposition party leader, and she should use it.
Phil Robinson, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.